And let's talk tarot historical archetypes some more, this time with the Emperor. Card number 4, of course the actual 5th card of the Major Arcana sequence. And no, this is not a tarot card here, this is a depiction of Charlemagne. You'll notice he's holding 2 objects, one in each hand, a sword and a globe. And the pair of objects was a common way to portray an emperor. So here we see 2 different versions. And you almost always get a rod-like object, sword, scepter, in one hand, and something much more compact in the other hand, often a globe or globe-like object, sometimes a building, which you saw in the last image, and here. Isn't that great? This one's not that small, but you get the point. This is Charlemagne again, by the way. He's kind of a touchstone in this video. But anyway, yeah, that was a common way of visually portraying emperors. Of course, it wasn't the only. You could also have just the scepter. Scepter, kind of the classic symbol of power, of course, and authority. And everything we've touched on so far play into the tarot tradition. So again, the scepter, symbol of power, a weapon like a sword, symbol of defending the realm, of course. A globe is an indication of, global power. I rule the world, even though no emperor actually ruled the entire world. And here's one of the very earliest surviving emperor tarot cards. And let's see what combination they decided to go with. Got the globe and the scepter. And here's another example from the very beginning of documented tarot. And we've got the scepter, as far as I can tell, right? I don't think there's anything else in that other hand. And both times they're seated, right? Seated in power. And that's something we see later on. So here's the Marseille depiction. And note the shield. The shield is fairly unique. It is, to me, a symbol of defending the realm, but it's a shield instead of a sword. Swords seem more common in the European artistic tradition that fed into tarot. And of course, it's not being held. It's down on the floor. And then we have the familiar scepter. Marseille cards are the most continuously used tarot cards in history. So of course this was influential, this depiction here, but funny enough, it doesn't match the earliest tarot cards, nor the later modern ones that set the template for, almost all tarot today, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and that, as we'll see. I know this is a really fuzzy image, but it's the only actual tarot card I found with a scepter-sword combination, so I thought that was interesting. Notice the eagle there reminds us of the eagle on the shield of the Marseille card. Now for a really different kind of emperor, here's Montezuma, and I just thought it was interesting because he has a shield. He actually has 2 weapons, right? But again, one thing in each hand. Very much a warrior depiction here. That's from the other side of the world, of course, and did not have an influence on tarot. Neither did this because this came way after, but I thought it was interesting. If you see the quotation on the bottom, it talks about, one empire. And then this visualization for the British Empire is, of course, holding a massive shield. A couple of random examples there, and off-the-beaten-path ones of why the shield makes sense on the Marseille pattern, but here's the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot Emperor, and they chose to go with the globe and scepter combination, which is, was quite common in antiquity. What's interesting and often overlooked, notice he's explicitly wearing armor. So again, you have that defensive, defense of the realm aspect, even though they eschewed the earlier Marseille mechanism for doing that. Obviously on this card we see esoteric symbolism. This was the obsession of the modern occultists, kind of, grafting, forcing various devices from the overall hodgepodge melting pot of mysticism and occultism, whether or not they had anything to do with the tarot's conception, and they didn't. But that was the giant reboot that tarot imagery and then interpretation went through overall in modernity. Let's page through some of the descriptions of the tarot card based on modern occultism. Here you'll see, just scanning, sorry for the yellow highlights, but that was part of the search function. There's astrological stuff, the card's related to Aries, the first of the zodiac symbols. There's more than one figure from the Greek pantheon noted. We're told he denotes great energizing forces, etc. Here's another text, and it agrees in a lot of ways. You see some of the same words, pioneer, which I didn't note last time, but it was there. A father figure, unification of wisdom. There's Himalayan rams. And in typical fashion, authority. Some of these actually managed to touch on the original iconography and what was really meant by the artist, and what it would have meant to the original users of the cards. But then you get all this other stuff just thrown in, kind of muddying the waters. Here's a scan from a book about tarot through the Jungian psychology lens, which I think is one of the most interesting ways to understand tarot and why it works, quote-unquote works. because I do think it can be a very interesting and productive mental exercise to go through. And you can see where even it gets into this realm of just pure speculation and stating such as fact. The Emperor is the energy, I'm going to truncate this, but that helps us regulate the impulses of the Empress. Well, okay, like where did that come from? I don't think that has any historical basis in terms of the story that the Major Arcana actually tell. But at least they're not claiming it's historical, whereas here in an old, early 20th century, maybe it was late 19th century, tarot text, you see things stated as historical fact that are just made up. The tarot represents the summary of the scientific knowledge of the ancients. In actuality, it was a late medieval, early Renaissance card game, but one that happens to tell a profound visual story nonetheless. And that profundity is what made it open to all these different interpretations. So here we're told that the Emperor seeks to remove the veil of Isis. Isis was most likely unknown to the card maker who invented the game of tarot. But anyway, let's move on. Here's one of the other major modern versions of the Emperor card. This is from Aleister Crowley's deck, which I'm sure a lot of you recognize instantly. And you can see where, just like with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which was made around the same time as this, you have different layers of esoteric symbolism imposed on the more historically grounded version of the Emperor. Here's another modern take. And overall, then, you can see that, the 20th century, that's when Aleister Crowley basically did his deck. That's when Rider-Waite-Smith came out. This here is a modern one. They were pretty true to the original, like the original Emperor. It's just that some, more than others, choose to lean into the occultism aspect and, pulling in new visual elements with all kinds of assorted meanings. Here's one that I thought was really interesting. Modern, like postmodern, and it seems to mix death with a classic version of the Emperor, and one that we saw from the very beginning of the video was historically accurate, the Sword and Scepter. Now let's talk about what the tarot card image would have meant to original users of the cards and people for, the first few centuries. Well, shockingly, it would have meant an emperor. Like I discussed with my kind of overview video, and I know in the Fool in particular, but really overall when it comes to this part of the Major Arcana, the cards are tracing out the ranks of mankind, something that was called an artistic tradition called the ranks of man. From the Fool, 0, to the Pope, our next card, 5. The cards gave a tour of humanity from lowest on the social ladder to highest, and that's why it ends with the Emperor, not just a king, right? The Emperor, and then the Pope. And if you're familiar with the actual history of the time and place of the tarot's invention, this is no surprise. See here in this image, for instance, the highest temporal authority, the highest earthly authority, and the highest religious authority were at the top of the food chain, a very hierarchical society back then, right? And they were often portrayed side by side, like here. And just like a knight on a playing card would represent a certain known, obvious thing to a viewer, so would the Emperor, right? So this is the top, again, of temporal power. This is somebody who's higher up than kings, someone who has multiple kings or kingdoms beneath them, or controls, a very wide swath of territory. Interesting here to see the globe device with a non-Western emperor image, right? And this isn't just some random figure that's in control or authority. This is an actual emperor from the East, from outside of Europe, seated with the globe. We can see how archetypal the image of the cards we're talking about today is. And like I said before, it's not that modern occultist mainstream tarot teachings get it all wrong. Yes, this figure obviously lends itself to interpretations about power, authority, and because it's the Emperor and there's an Empress card, so one for the female principle, yeah, male authority in your life, which of course could lead to thinking about, your father or a male boss or something like that. And going back to more of that Jungian perspective, seeing something like this could, this archetypal image could make you think about your inner emperor, right? About how you need to take control or, elevate yourself to the level that you want to be at in your career or whatever. And now let's get back to our emperor and death, because you saw that a few images back, and here it is again, and there is no shortage of that, just like there's no shortage of images of all of the ranks of man or mankind, humanity, with death in medieval art. This was a consequence of the Black Death. I've talked about this before. Basically, there is no artistic tradition more important to understanding tarot than the Dance of Death, or the Dance Macabre. from the highest to the lowest, like this itinerant jester here. Or should I say fool? Or this beggar here. The message overall was everybody is going to die. It doesn't matter how powerful you are. It doesn't matter how rich you are. We're all equal in the eyes of death, and we'll all get treated the same way. See death there in the middle with his crossbow, so not even the person on the highest part of this hierarchy gets an exemption. So even though this was a central tenet of the tarot's story, the story that the 22 cards of the major arcana tell, you'll find almost no mention of it in mainstream modern tarot teachings. And the other aspect is just in terms of popular culture, vulgar art, parades, processions in the Renaissance, you always saw a gallery of humanity. You'd see some people dressed as jesters, you'd see some people dressed as kings, that kind of a thing. Magicians, basically all of the characters from the major arcana, really. Again, it's really unsurprising what we see in the cards then when we think about the time and the place of their birth. So that's a lot more real and less speculative than theorizing about the cards being an expression of Hermetic philosophy or based on astrology, just being a construct that's meant to complement astrology or be used as an expression of it. But speaking of occultism, there's an aspect that I think does jibe with the card itself, like in a fairly explicit way. This is card number 4, and that's probably not a surprise, because in terms of numerology, 4 denotes stability. And an emperor needs to be a figure of stability, right? It has to bring stability to his empire. And why is 4 a number associated with stability? Well, probably because tables and chairs have 4 legs, houses have 4 walls, that kind of a thing. 4 is a number of order. It's how people ordered the world around them. North, south, east, west, the 4 seasons, etc. This image here is nothing New Agey or anything like that. This is from the Maori culture in New Zealand. I thought it was really interesting. It's this construct that they have, these 4 walls being the main 4 forces that you need working in harmony to be healthy and happy, right? So it's kind of mind, body, spirit, and relationships. So here's an example from a completely different culture showing how 4 just naturally lends itself to interpretations of stability. And I do think that plays into the card. It's not that no esoteric philosophies or thoughts work their way into the cards at all. The Renaissance was a time of experimentation and discovering older ideas, and things that we now think of as exotic, like astrology and numerology, were on the minds of the Italian courts and other aristocratic courts. So it's not that stuff isn't present at all. There's 3 cards in the major arcana that are clearly concerned with astrological phenomenon and meanings. But it's obvious when you see them. It's in those cards, not cards like this. No, this isn't the tarot card that I'm showing now, but you know what I mean. The Emperor card, number 4. No, it's not a stand-in for Jupiter. In Art of the Time, if they wanted to show Jupiter, they would actually show Jupiter, the god. And they didn't have to hide a pagan deity like that. They used that kind of thing in art all the time. Going back then to the actual intent of this card, it's a lasting archetype, right? Here's a seated emperor from the Star Wars movies. He strikes a very familiar pose, right? So we'll go through some final images here to show the lasting power of the actual visual template that we see in card number 4. The original image then, notice the similarity here, notice the eagle symbol, right? And this is an actual ancient depiction of an emperor, as you can imagine, from long before the tarot. Here's a non-Western emperor. I thought this was interesting. Look at how he's seated and what he's holding. And in summary, as is often the case, it's actually fairly obvious what's being depicted on tarot cards, and they tap into something deep. Just because they're not stand-ins for something much more mysterious and esoteric doesn't mean that they're not really interesting and that they don't go to something, buried in our psyche and useful as something to grapple with if you do put down some cards and try to think through a given situation, right? It's a mental prompt, it's an artistic prompt, and ultimately it's a historically accurate one as well. This image here, by the way, is of a fake emperor. In a way, this is a figure that was believed by Christians in Europe to run kind of a utopian Christian kingdom that was isolated by the pagan world, right, by the Islamic world, and they wanted to reach him, get his help in the Crusades. Many believed his empire was in India, others in other places. Anyway, his name was Prester John, and it's an interesting fable that many in the Middle Ages thought was real. And anyway, I thought that was an interesting confluence with the Papis, who we already talked about in a previous video. Anyway, thanks a lot.